Hello and welcome to your lecture on the Roman Empire for our classical age time period. The Roman Empire is one of the largest empires that we're going to study during this time period and probably one of the most significant in regards to long-term impact. So the Roman Empire comes out of what was the Roman Republic. The Republic system lasted around 500 years, and basically there were a ruling class who were called patricians, and the patricians held your political and religious offices, and then the lower classes were called plebeians. Eventually, the plebeians were able to gain their own representative council that did impact government later on, and I will discuss that later in the lecture. The executive office was held by two consuls. They were elected out of the Senate, and they would hold power for 1 year. So they were the head of the Senate, they controlled the military, and they proposed laws. They didn't necessarily make the laws, but they did propose the laws for the Senate to debate. They could ultimately, after they served their 1 year as consul, they would become a proconsul, or basically a governor of a different territory after his individual term. Then you have this complex bureaucratic system where you had judges and financial officers. You had a person who was specifically in charge of maintaining cities like waterways and things like that. There was a special office that was elected every 5 years called the censor, and the censor was basically taking a census. The Romans were very careful about their record keeping, and he counted the citizens and all their property. And one of the power of the censor was removing senators from office if they were found to be immoral, or if they no longer held property, or other situations that would allow the censor to remove senators from office. This is a very important office and very powerful office. Dictators were elected out of the Senate, and they were only elected during emergencies, and they were only allowed to hold office for 6 months. This is where Julius Caesar comes in. Julius Caesar claimed to be dictator for life. He said that the Roman Republic was in a time of civil war and in crisis, which it technically was. There were generals fighting each other nonstop, and he said that he should be dictator for life. Obviously, that goes against the idea of a republican democracy, and so he was ultimately murdered on the floor of the Senate assassinated due to his overreaching for power. That crisis will ultimately lead to the development of the empire system. The political system also had assemblies which were local, and the highest assembly obviously was the Senate, which was more of the whole republic, but they had elected councils in the local regions, and the assemblies were advisors to the council, and the assembly or the Senate definitely remained in place during the empire system. And they proposed laws as well, and the Senate is the one that ultimately approved the laws, and they oversaw foreign policy, and they controlled the country's finances. And they had all kinds of other administrative duties. So this was a very complex bureaucratic system. The Comitia Centuria is basically the ones who the Senate would propose the laws, and then this small assembly would officially enact the laws. And the people who sat on this smaller committee were chosen by consuls. And the people who sat on this committee were usually senators anyway. Then you had your plebeian council. They were there to voice their concerns for the lower classes, but it took a long time for their law code to actually come into play. And the plebeian council actually are the ones that create the official law code for Rome that exists throughout the empire time period, called the 12 Tables. And the 12 Tables was meant to be basic laws and ethics that everyone within the Roman Republic and ultimately empire were supposed to follow. However, the 12 Tables was passed in 450 BCE, but the patricians didn't have to follow the 12 Tables. They were exempt from the 12 Tables because it came from the lower class assembly. They eventually passed a new law that said that the patricians had to follow the laws passed by the Council of Plebes. So that means that you had the committee out of the Senate that would pass laws, and then the plebeian council that would also create and pass laws. This is the size of the Roman Republic at its height, up to 133 BCE. There was land loss, which is ultimately what led to the civil war that Julius Caesar took advantage of. So you can see they were in the Italian peninsula. You can see Rome in the center there, and they spread up through the Italian peninsula into Sicily, down into they did not control Carthage, but the Carthage was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BCE, and the Romans are going to influence northern Africa. They're going to go up into the Rhone River Valley, which is basically going to lead into the Julius Caesar's conquering of France, which is called Gaul on this map, and then down the Spanish coastline. What ultimately happens to the Republic is 100% internal. There were no foreign or outside issues that caused the fall of the Republic system. There was an increased tension between the rich and poor because of the crisis that was created out of invasion and expansion. And there were several attempts at land reform, but it kept creating revolts. Now, this is a couple centuries of fall here for the end of the Republic. Tribute areas that were seeking Roman citizenship wanted to become part of the Roman Republic, and that caused controversy as well. Defining what it was to be Roman was an issue, and so that was kind of a cultural problem that the Republic was facing as well. So Julius Caesar becomes dictator for life and ultimately was assassinated. The Senate decides that they were in crisis and that they were unable to solve their problems, and so they went ahead and created the empire system with Caesar's nephew Augustus, Octavian Augustus, who will take the title first consul and ultimately emperor in 31 BCE. So the empire's political system and structure was the tiered bureaucracy set up by the Republic. The emperors didn't really change much, other than the fact that the emperor created laws. The emperor passed all laws and edicts and ultimately created this Principum Constitution that said that he ruled by decree, and he could make up the rules as he went, and he could create laws however he pleased. This eliminates the system that we talked about in the Republic as far as the different councils that were creating the laws. The Senate is often going to use assassination as a tool to check the emperor's power. There's several emperors that are going to be assassinated by the Senate, and usually those emperors were corrupt. The part of the problem is the hereditary line for the office of emperor was very messed up and very skewed. And so because the emperors were allowed to adopt, and that created very messed up lines, and so you ended up with people in office that were not necessarily the best emperors, and so you often had times where you had a series of emperors that were very bad for Rome, and the Romans were able to deal with that. The senators would deal with that through assassination. One of the things that Augustus is going to do is to split the territories into provinces, and the emperors would appoint a governor for each one of those provinces, and then the local systems were put into place for each of those different province. And so again, we're just re-emphasizing that tiered bureaucracy that was already in place, and as they expanded, they would extend governorships to the emperor would handpick the governors, and so they were there was a nepotism there in regards to who the emperor would put in place where. The areas were really independent and locally run, but they were subject to Rome's taxes, and they were subject to the Roman military. So all of these different provinces would have legionnaires. The Roman military were in place, and it was a very intimidating system. And the Romans, the citizens of the areas, both benefited from the Roman military being there because there were still a lot of nomadic Germanic tribes running around at the time, and so the Roman Empire was a very safe place to be during this time period because of these barbarian tribes, and the military also were used as kind of a police force in the different areas as well. The 12 tables remained in place and was a base law code, but like I said, the emperor was the one who was passing and making most of the laws. Here's an explanation of the three type of provinces that were developed in the Roman Empire. You can see a map of the height of the Roman Empire, which was in 117 CE. The senatorial provinces was where the Senate appointed a governor. There was a very, very little chance of rebellion because of the so there wasn't a lot of military presence in these areas. You can see that these areas are very close to central Rome, and these areas were very Roman culturally and had been part of the Republic, and so there was very little chance that these people were going to rebel. Also, if you notice, these pink senatorial provinces on the map were flanking most of the major Mediterranean sea route trades, trade routes, so they were not going to rebel against the economy of the Roman Empire. It was very important to their well-being. The imperial provinces were where the Roman emperor appointed the governor. These are more outlying areas. These are border states, and so the emperor was usually putting old generals as governors in these regions so that they could be protected militarily. The client states were areas where they were allied with Rome, and they chose to be part of the Roman Empire for self-preservation. So these are going to be areas that are threatened by tribal groups, and they're usually used to not only were they gaining protection of the military, the Roman military, but also they were border areas that were going to protect the whole of the Roman Empire from these kind of barbarian tribes. Rome also got trade and loyalty against unconquered tribes through these different outlying client states. As far as economics for the Roman Empire, there was regional, interregional, and international trade routes. There's a map on the next slide that kind of discusses these different trade routes, and we will discuss the Silk Road in detail. The trade route, the Roman Empire exported wine, olive oil, cereal, and slaves, and they imported metals, marble, spices, and slaves. Merchants were inferior to landowners, so it wasn't necessarily they were very rich, but they were unable to purchase land because land was had become hereditary by the time that this system was set up, and so merchants were very rich, but they did not necessarily own any land, so therefore they didn't have political influence at all. Towns were where people consumed things, and the larger cities and the harbors would produce the goods. Despite the Roman roads, sea trade was way cheaper, but sea trade was also more dangerous. So even though the Romans spent a lot of time and energy, especially with the use of concrete, on creating these Roman roads, the Roman roads were used more for military purposes rather than economic. Most merchants were still trading through the sea trade lanes. And some ships were large enough to carry 300 tons of goods, but most of them were smaller and carried 75 tons. Remember, most of this is going to be done within the Mediterranean Sea and along rivers. So the Silk Road obviously is going to bring all of those Asian trade goods through land, and then they would kind of get into harbor areas, and they would go in through the Mediterranean Sea trade lanes as a result of the peace and prosperity that the Roman Empire created. If you were a ship, however, there were piracy issues and, of course, weather. There's tons and tons of shipwrecks that archaeologists are constantly excavating in the Mediterranean Sea region that are associated with this Roman trade. Here's your map of some of the Mediterranean Sea trade lanes. So you can see they did use the Red Sea down by Egypt, and then of course the Mediterranean Sea. Your major cities like Alexandria, Carthage, Rome are going to be some of your, and Byzantium, which will ultimately be Constantinople. The blue lines that are coming in are your external trade routes. So these are areas where non-Romans were trading within the Roman Empire, and then of course you have your green ones, which the green area, which is your Iranian or your Persian tribal nations, and so they were not necessarily they would trade, they were foreign traders, so that's where you get your international trade. Your inter-regional trade is obviously the mix between the sea-based and the land-based trade that was going on within the different area, and you can see some of the different goods that were produced or grown or in the different regions. So tin and copper are very important. Gold and silver are very important because the Romans did use coinage in their trade and their economics, and so that was important to to their entire system. And you can see the cost of the empire down there in the corner. So it talks about the revenue. The Romans taxed all of this trade. It was kind of like a sales tax, and that is what is able to keep the Roman Empire going for so very long, because this sales tax was very, very high, and it actually provided 70% of the revenue of the budget for the Roman Empire went to military. And so this sales tax is what's going to provide for that. The state did have a lot of control of economics. The emperors and the empire did actually influence economics quite a bit. They created a supply system where they were making sure that basic food supplies were reaching everywhere. So cereals, like I said in the previous slide, was very, very important to the Roman diet. And so they were making sure, the Roman emperors made sure that all of the regions were getting that base food supply, which creates stability like the Pax Romana for the Roman Empire. There was also a merchant fleet that was controlled by the government itself, and there was a specific person in charge of grain. And the ships were organized into these guild-like associations where you would have a guild of cereal traders or a guild of tin traders, and they had to report to the government, and the government actually had a lot to do with where these supplies were going, and that was that annona system. Obviously, like I said, there was a tax on goods, and 80% of the government's money came from these sales taxes. The other 20% is going to come from conquering, and the large landowners would hold markets once a week, and these markets were controlled by the Senate or the emperor, depending on what type of province it was. So if it was a senatorial province, then the Senate would approve. If it was an emperor province, then the emperor would approve. Most goods had a stamp to guarantee the purity and weight of that good, which again creates an unbelievable stability for their economic system. And that stamp of approval was they had an inspector system where all the goods and whatnot were inspected, much like what we have today. Coins were minted by the state. Local mints did exist, but those local coins were always valued based on the Roman denarii. So the coinage also served as propaganda, as obviously the emperors would put their face on these coins, and the local governors would sometimes end up on the coins. And again, this standardization of coins for weights and measures creates stability within the system. The Roman military system was 70% of the state budget, and obviously the Roman roads, like I said, were used for supply lines for the military. They also built things like walls and lots of forts and things like that around your major cities, and of course along your border states. So Hadrian's Wall is an example of this. That's up in the British Isles. So the Scot tribes were considered a barbarian tribe by the Romans, and they were often kind of fighting with the British tribes, like the Welsh and the English. And so that's why the British Isle became a client state to the Roman Empire. And Emperor Hadrian funded this huge wall that was built up to kind of split the Scot tribes from the British tribes. And through the Roman video that some of you guys are going to watch in class, you'll actually see it's more than just a wall, it's a fortification. The military often were police force rather than being on campaign. Most of your military officers didn't actually go conquering very much. It was limited to certain emperors that were conquering, so what the military did with a lot of their time was building, clearing land, draining marshes. They cleared forests, and the purpose of this clearing the land and the marshes and all that kind of stuff is to expand their farms and to be able to meet the population needs. Because whenever you have stability, you're going to have an increase in population, and so that just leads to the increased need for more food. And so the military was actually an important part of that process. There were 3 forms of military units. So you have your legionnaires or your legions. These are your heavy infantry. Only Roman citizens were allowed to be a legionnaire, and at first they were conscripted. They were drafted into the system, but eventually they had enough volunteers, and these volunteers, they were career military people, they would serve pretty much their entire life through the military. They were higher class than the auxilia troops, and they had the better equipment, they had higher social classes, they had a higher pay, they had lots of benefits from being in the Legion. The auxilia classes were your non-citizens. These are your cavalry, your archers, and other different military specialties. And ultimately, these two, the legions and the auxilia, will merge under Emperor Caracalla. Caracalla is going to grant everybody in the empire citizenship, and so there's no need to have this distinction between the two. So the social and economic distinctions disappeared by the 3rd century, which is actually part of the Roman fall. The distinction, part of the lack of the ability of the Roman Empire to pay the legions the higher prices that they were, the higher wages that they were being paid early on, was a huge problem. There were also the numeri, and the numeri were basically another form of military, and these were mercenary troops from outside the empire. So if a Scotsman kind of made his way into Britannia, he could be hired as a mercenary. The barbarian tribes were very good fighters, and so the Romans were trying to control them and use them against themselves if they could. Socially, it's a hierarchical system, but the positions are very, very complex. There's 4 different types of ways you could be labeled within the social structure of the Roman Empire. Obviously, you have your ancestry that's left over from the Roman Republic. So you were either lower class plebeian or upper class patrician. The patrician were your landowners. Then you have your census rank. So in the Roman Empire often took a census, and so this is where your wealth or your political position came into play. Okay. However, if you were lower class, you could attain honors through military or through other different ways, and that elevated your position. Citizenship was a whole nother rank. So you, if you were a Roman citizen, you had different rights and privileges than the non-citizens, but local areas determines the varying rights based off of the non-citizens. For most of the Roman Empire, the citizens were the ones who could vote and had a say in their government, and non-citizens did not. But this varies as well. So, for example, women throughout the Roman Empire were granted citizenship, but they were not allowed to vote. So it's a very complex structure. Slaves were a huge portion of the labor system of the Roman Empire. They were property and they had no rights. You became a slave by being in debt, or if you were a prisoner of war. Most of your prisoners of war slaves were women and children. And if you were an unskilled slave, then you would work in agriculture. If you had some type of skill, then you would probably work for a certain patrician in a certain specific skill, like a house slave. Or if you were trained in blacksmithing, then you would kind of work in that blacksmith guild. Slaves could earn their freedom, and they often did. And once they gained their freedom, they could regain their citizenship rights as well. The social structure was also based off this patron-client system, kind of like the mob, and the idea that I scratch your back, you scratch mine. It was a system of reciprocity where everybody kind of benefited from it. So each, your lower class, you would have a patrician who you kind of worked with and worked for, and that person would offer you protection in return for different services that you could possibly provide. Of course, it was patriarchal. The paterfamilias, the head of the Roman family, had legal power over his entire family. Women would leave the paterfamilias family to go marry into another family, and then that paterfamilias, the eldest male, had legal power over her when she entered that family. As far 32% of the Roman population lived in city centers. These cities served as economic centers. The forum was actually the marketplace. In actual Rome, the forum is super important to propaganda, so the emperors kept building in the forum to kind of show their power. Obviously, a lot of the Roman emperors spent a huge amount of time on water. Water was very important to the well-being and the stability of the empire, and so the aqueducts would kind of flow into the Roman cities, and the Romans had fountains everywhere, and these fountains were basically the way that they got their water supply. So the fountains were more than just art; they were actually there to supply water for the citizens. The cities were also meant to be places for taxation collection. Then you have your political, these cities also served as political centers. The buildings that were built to house like the local governments and judges and all that kind of stuff were called basilicas. Basilicas in the Middle Ages and in the revitalization of Europe through the Renaissance then become churches. These cities also served as religious centers, as many monuments and temples were built to the different Roman gods and goddesses. One of the most famous and largest is the Pantheon, which is in actual Rome. This is one of the larger buildings built under the Roman Empire. Obviously, you can see the Greek influence with the use of the columns, but one of the new techniques that architecturally will have a huge impact on construction is the oculus, which is this hole in the ceiling, which in the dome, which allows for the weight of the dome to be supported by itself, so you don't have to have poles and columns. This is important in regards to architecture, and there is a assignment that you guys will be doing based on that information later in the unit. One of the most important parts of the urban centers for Rome was entertainment. They built great coliseums in these areas where they would have the gladiator fights. The baths were like, I guess, a comparison to modern day Starbucks, where you would go and you would socialize. This is mainly for the patricians, but there were lower class areas as well within the bath systems. So a lot of your emperors did build a bath system, and again, that control of water is very powerful. If you keep your people fed and watered, then obviously you're going to keep your empire running. And so the availability of cleanliness was important to the control of disease and to population control as well. And so that's why the building of baths was super important. Obviously, they would build they would have chariot races, and so you have things like Circus Maximus, which was just a racetrack that was built in Rome. Constantinople will also have a very large racetrack that's built under the Byzantine Empire. So the idea is that if you feed your people and you keep them entertained, then they will be controlled, which is what the Roman emperors kind of created, this bread and circuses type of attitude towards their citizens. If they are entertained, then they don't have time to think about their government and they don't have time to think about rebelling. Here are some of the major cities throughout the Roman Empire. Obviously, number 7, Rome itself is super important. And if you go up to look on the British Isles, and then you see the number 1 city, which it will ultimately become London. It was built along the Thames River. Another important city is 14, which is Constantinople. Constantinople will become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire once the Western Roman Empire falls. And the sacking of Constantinople in 1453 is the signaling of the official end of the Roman Empire in its completion. It is sacked by the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which and you can see the importance of Constantinople in regards to trade because it goes into that Black Sea. So you can trade up with the what will ultimately become the Slavic Russian area. And you can get goods like furs and things like that from Russia down through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean Sea trade. So Constantinople, we will talk about Constantinople constantly in this class. It's very, very important. If you look down at 18 in Egypt, this is Alexandria. Obviously, Alexandria was built by Alexander the Great, but the Romans are going to take over and turn it into a very Roman city. Julius Caesar is going to conquer this territory, and Egypt is kind of a client state and operates on its own, but Alexandria is very important in regards to getting African goods up into the Mediterranean Sea trade areas. As far as Roman culture goes, we have the Romanization of language. What ends up happening is all of the local languages that were spoken end up being Latinized, and that's how we get our Romance languages like French and Italian and Spanish. English is actually a Germanic language, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. But Latin becomes the base for the languages throughout what will eventually become Europe. The eastern part of the empire continued to speak Greek. And they actually will create a new alphabet called the Cyrillic alphabet in order to use, because the Greek language is very different from the Latin language. And so the Romanization of the languages throughout Western Europe is where they start using phonetic spelling, and they use the Phoenician alphabet to create these Romance languages. Clothing styles, as far as culture goes, were different for each class level. So like the senators would wear tunics with purple stripes, the patricians would wear a specific color sandal, and then the senators actually wore a specific color sandal. Consuls and emperors wore white sandals to kind of symbolize the purity of their office. So clothing is very important to showing your social class within the Roman culture. As far as education goes, upper class children were educated, girls and boys were educated reading, writing, and counting, and of course Greek from the ages of 6 to 12, and then the boys would continue on after that. Oratory skills were also taught, as speaking, because of the structure of the Roman Empire. Oratory skills and being able to speak publicly was very important, and so it was continuously taught throughout the education system. As far as literature goes for the Romans, they did have official histories written throughout the Roman Empire, and history as a field is really solidified by what the Romans were doing. Obviously, they're going to feed off what the Greeks were doing as well, because you do have Greek histories. You do have some epic poetry coming out of the Roman culture under Virgil, and hopefully you'll study that within your poetry unit in your English classes. The art and architecture of Roman culture will be discussed through a different assignment within the course. As far as Roman religion goes, Augustus actually creates an age of revitalizing of the Roman religion, and he uses it to kind of create this emperor worship, and he uses ancestor veneration to kind of do that. And so they kind of get like this godlike status the emperors do through this propaganda that Augustus creates. And if you reject the state religion, it's considered treason, which is why the Christians were persecuted. The practice and development of the religion was completed in secret, of Christianity was completed in secret through most of Roman history. However, the religion, because of its universalizing aspects, spreads to the lower classes. Constantine is going to become a patron of Christianity. He issues the Edict of Milan in 313, which allows Christians to worship in public, and then he starts building churches, and he allows the creation of these churches. Because Constantine is going to build Constantinople, you're going to see very Christian architecture within Constantinople, which we'll talk about again later. He also had a meeting in Nicaea that's called the Council of Nicaea, which is 320 and 325, and this is where the bishops of the churches are going to come together and create what will become the official Catholic doctrine for the most part. Obviously, there's going to be changes through time, but this is where they argue the divinity of Christ. They pick the books that will become the New Testament, and they basically solidify and create the system for Christianity. He himself converts to Christianity on his deathbed. Theodosius the Great is the last emperor to rule both Western and Eastern Rome, and he made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire, which is going to create some kind of cultural unity for Europe through the Dark Ages once Rome falls. The empire falls due to the 3rd century crisis. There's an economic depression. The Han Dynasty in China falls, so the Silk Road stops. And so areas become economically isolated, and they start having issues meeting their basic needs. There's also a plague, which causes probably smallpox, that kills off a huge portion of the class of the citizens, which causes a labor problem. And then there's the Civil War that's also an issue. And then you have size and border issues. Here's the invasions of the Roman Empire and the different tribes that are going to attack, and we'll look at this in more detail through another assignment. Ultimately, the Roman Empire is split between Western Rome and Eastern Rome under Diocletian, but it doesn't work, and Rome will ultimately fall. Again, we'll address this later in another assignment throughout the course. I hope you enjoyed your Roman Empire lecture. Have a good day.